until that day comes. Still I will praise you. Still I will praise you. Oh no, you never let go through the storm. Oh no, you never let go. In every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go. Lord, you never let go of me. In need of grace, in need of love, in need of mercy raining down from high above, in need of strength, in need of peace, in need of things that only you can give to me. In need of Christ, the perfect Lamb, my refuge strong, the great I am. This is my song, my humble plea. I am your child, I am in need. In need of grace, in need of love, in need of mercy raining down from high above, in need of strength, in need of peace, in need of things that only you can give to me. In need of Christ, the perfect Lamb, my refuge strong, the great I am. This is my song, my humble plea. I am your child, I am in need. In need of Christ, the perfect Lamb, my refuge strong, the great I am. This is my song, my humble plea. I am your child, I am in need. I am your child, I am in need. I still have joy, I still have joy, after all the things we've been through. I still have joy, I still have joy, I still have joy, after all the things we've been through. I still have joy, I still have peace, I still have peace, after all the things we've been through. I still have peace, and I still have faith, I still have faith, after all the things we've been through. I still have faith, I still have hope, I still have hope, after all the things we've been through. I still have hope, I still have love, sweet love, I still have love, after all the things we've been through. I still have love, and I still have joy, I still have joy, I still have joy, after all the things we've been through, after all the things we've been through, after all the things we've been through. I still have joy. Every praise is to our God, every word of worship with one accord. Every praise is to our God. Sing hallelujah to our God. Glory, hallelujah is to our God. Every praise is to our God. Every praise is to our God. Every word of worship with one accord. Every praise is to our God. Sing hallelujah to our God. Glory, hallelujah is to our God. Every praise is to our God. God my Savior, God my healer, God my deliverer. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. God my Savior, God my healer, God my deliverer. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. God my Savior, God my healer, God my deliverer. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. Every praise is to our God. Every word of worship with one accord. Every praise is to our God. Sing hallelujah to our God. Glory, hallelujah is to our God. Every praise is to our God. When I'm down, Lord, you pick me up. Then I fall on my knees. When I'm dry, Lord, you fill my cup. You always give what I need, and yours, Lord, I'll always be. When everything's right, I will praise you. In seasons of joy, I will sing, and even in trials, I'll still raise you. For you are my glorious King. Yes, you are my glorious King. When I'm up and blessings abound, and your grace falls like rain. When your love and mercy surround, Lord, I will praise you again. My God, Redeemer and friend. When everything's right, I will praise you. In seasons of joy, I will sing, and even in trials, I'll still praise you. For you are my glorious King. Yes, you are my glorious King. You came for me in the form of a man, bearing my sins on a cross, taking the shame and
All right. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see everybody out on a wet Wednesday evening. Good to see Paula and Steve here. All right. If you would, open up your Bibles to Exodus chapter 12. We'll start there in just a moment. And before we get started this evening, we're going to go to God in a word of prayer. Our great and heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your majesty, your glory, and your word that you have given to us. We're thankful for your Son and your Spirit, and we ask that you be with us tonight, that you'd open our hearts and our minds to the message that is contained within your word, and that it would reveal to us your power, your glory, and your ability to free man from his sins and his captivity and his bondage, and to free us to salvation to serve you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so despite what that says, this is actually class 10. And just as a reminder, here's what we're going to do tonight. So we're going to finish up the final plague on Egypt, and then we're going to talk about the mechanics of the Passover. We're going to talk about the meal in general, and then the next time we're going to talk more about what the meal means in light of us and Christ, and how the Passover relates to Christ as our Passover lamb. So all of that is coming next Sunday. So tonight we're just solely going to focus on exactly the mechanics of it and get used to that idea and everything that's in it. And we'll talk a little bit about what it meant to the Israelites, but we won't look at it in its broader context of what God is doing in redemptive history until we get to next Sunday, and that'll be a full class unto itself. So with that being said, let's finish up the 10th plague. So as you'll recall last time, I'm not going to go through a whole bunch of this. We had talked about this last time. The last plague was actually something that had been foretold previously in the book of Exodus. Moses had been told it's going to go down this way. I'm going to reveal all these mighty works. And at the end of it, if Pharaoh doesn't let you go, you, Israel, my firstborn son, if Pharaoh won't let you go, then I will kill Pharaoh's firstborn son. And that was retold, and so we have that restated there in the first 3 verses of Exodus chapter 11. We see the difference of opinion between Pharaoh and his servants there. We see that they are plundering the Egyptians there, that we actually talked about them taking the goods and things from all the different Egyptians, and how this was a completely different kind of plague, that it was one that was affected directly, caused deaths directly of Egyptians, and that the Israelites plundered the Egyptians for all their labor that they had done for the 400 plus years that they had been in captivity there. We also, I think we're right about here, if it will advance. There it goes. So right here in Exodus chapter 11, verses 4 through 10, this is about where we were last time when we ended. And we were talking about this concept that God himself will go through and will go through the land and will destroy the firstborn. All the other plagues he was directly responsible for, but this one he says, I personally am going to go through the land and I will be the agent of destruction here. And we talked about the destroyer being another name, obviously used interchangeably with God in those verses and in several other verses that we talked about last time. It's going to affect all peoples, both the people and the livestock. People from every background are going to be affected from the top to the bottom of the Egyptian society. And we also see, and this is about where we ended last class. So if you'll look there in verse 6, it talks about, there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, no shall be like it again. Now, if you go back to Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 and 9, and you read over there the Lord says to Moses, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And again in verse 9, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come out to me. Well, these two words in the Hebrew are the exact same thing. And it's an idea that the expression of the Israelites, the woes of the Israelites and their cry to God is going to be mirrored. The greatness of the cry of the Israelites that rose up to God that caused him to take notice of their suffering is now going to be mirrored by the cry and the woes of the Egyptians as God strikes them in this judgment. And this is again a common theme that we see all throughout the Bible, is that those who are lifted up, God does what? Those that are lifted up, God pulls down. Those that have been humbled, God exalts. And this is a principle that plays itself out over and over and over again. And that's one of the things that I tried to emphasize in this last class, is that a lot of the patterns that we see develop in the Bible really start for the first time in the book of Exodus. And this is one of those patterns that again presents itself where those who are lifted up are pulled down, those who are humbled before God are lifted up into their place. And so we see that exact thing going on here. And so again, it kind of precipitates this complete reversal of fortunes, where Moses even says, your servants are going to come and bow down before me. So just as we have been forced to bow down before you, Pharaoh, for the past 400 years, now the tables are going to be turned. Now you and your servants are going to come and bow down before me. And of course, we do see that exactly happen in Exodus chapter 12 when he sends emissaries to Moses there in Exodus chapter 12. He asks for a blessing. And so verses 9 and 10 kind of form like the capstone of the plagues. And the Lord just basically, so as this book was compiled, these verses are put in here just as a reminder that Pharaoh's not going to heed you, and this was expressly done so that all of my wonders would be done before Pharaoh, and that the world would know how great a God I am. All right. So with that being said, the actual fulfillment of it comes in Exodus chapter 12, 29 through 41. And we see over there in those verses that the Lord does come, and he comes in a slightly different version there, but basically every house from the dungeon to the Pharaoh's palace is under judgment and is destroyed, has a dead person in it. There's not a single house in the entire nation of Egypt in which there isn't someone dead. You can imagine, obviously, and I don't know, I didn't actually go pull it, but I didn't go pull to see exactly what the population of Egypt was at this time. But just imagine tomorrow morning we woke up and there was one person dead in every home in Bowling Green or Warren County. It would be a national, we can think about this on all kinds of levels, but you can just imagine, just even, let's start, my mind goes here and I don't know why it does. That would be a logistical nightmare. I know that's not the first thing that maybe came to your mind, but the first thing that came to my mind is that's a lot of dead bodies to have to do something with immediately. That's a lot of medical professionals. That's a lot of disposing of human bodies, of funerals, so you can imagine the outcry, and that's to say nothing of the toil. Imagine what that would do to our local economy. I don't know how many houses are in Bowling Green. I don't know how many houses are in Warren County. If one person, even if it was a child, was dead in all of them, everything about this area would be a national disaster. It would be told everywhere all the time. And that's exactly what God's intent is in all these plagues, is that, and we see it obviously as you get further into the Pentateuch, and as we get over into Joshua, when they show up in the land of Canaan, those people know about what happened here. People talk about this. Here we are still obviously thousands of years later talking about it. And so not only are the Israelites permitted to leave, but they are required to leave. Now, I think that's pretty key. Why do you think that's key? Why do you think God made it to this degree? There's this difference between if Pharaoh said, okay, you can go. Pharaoh could have come out and said, okay, you can go. But Pharaoh instead came out and said, no, you all get out. Why is that significant? What might have happened if he said, okay, you can go? Think about what might have happened. Some people would have stayed. We're going to get into this a little bit later. Think about this from the Israelite standpoint. What do they know? What has their lives been to this point? Egypt is all they know. Egypt is all they know. Egypt is all their parents knew. Egypt is all their grandparents knew. And for many generations back, and that's all they've known. All they've known is slavery for generations. And that's it. They don't know how to do anything else. It's a tremendous act of faith. It's an act of faith that mirrors who? Their forefather, Abraham. When God said, get up and get out of the country that is your forefathers, and I'm going to take you to a land that you never knew, that's a tremendous act of faith. He didn't know where he's going. He didn't have a clue what he's going to do when he gets there. These people are in the same boat. They've never done anything. Some of them maybe have never done anything except for tend the small flocks that they have and make the bricks for Egypt that they've made. And now they're being required to leave the only land that they ever knew. So I think it's important that it went to this degree that they were forced out. God is obviously guiding them into the nation that he wants them to be. And this is what I alluded to here, a humbled Pharaoh, as you'll see in verse 33. In verse 32 says, also take your flocks and your herds, and as you have said, be gone and bless me also. So after all that, after all the question, remember where we started? Who is the Lord? Who is Yahweh that I should obey him and let you go? Turns into, get out and please put a blessing on me on your way out. So he's a tremendous, and that's the top secret. And we know, as we're going to see here in the next few class periods, that doesn't last for very long, but for this brief moment of time, there's some part of Pharaoh's brain that's like lucid for just a little bit, and he's like, get out and take everybody and bless me. It's funny to me that it doesn't last, but it doesn't. But he, in this brief moment of time, acknowledges who God is and what has to be done here. All right. Let's take a look at the Passover for the time that we've got left tonight. So the Passover, what we see it covered here in Exodus chapter 12, primarily in verses 1 through 28. I'm going to give you kind of some overall structure here. So the first 14 verses of this chapter are instructions to Moses and Aaron by God on how to conduct the Passover, all right? So that's the first 14 verses of it, and it's given specifically to Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron obviously serve as intermediaries of expressing God's wishes to the elders and to the people. So he gives them those instructions. Verses 15 through 20 are instructions on the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which we're also going to try and cover tonight as well. And then verses 21 through 28 is Moses relaying the instructions that he got from God to the elders, and then they obey. All right, and then Moses gives a little bit of additional color in those verses that's not given in the previous verses on how to obey all of that. There's also additional instructions that are given about who is eligible to keep the Passover in verses 43 through 49 that we'll look at as well. So, with that being said, the narrative of the story, it's very interesting that the narrative of the story, so we have the writer of the Exodus, we have Moses and the compiler, and they're putting all this together right into this book, and they're telling this nice story, and up to this point, it's been one continuous story. So we've had this story that's going, and then all of a sudden we break, and then there's this bit of law that's given here. Now, why, to our minds, that's not how you would do that. We would say, okay, write the story and then give us the Kentucky Revised Statutes at the end, or in a different book. I don't want to read the statutes when I'm reading my story. I want to read my story and then read my statutes. So why do you think it's put here in this particular way? Any thoughts on that? Okay. So, yeah, I don't know. But here's, one of the things I would say here, the event that's here and the feast that is precipitated by it are so interconnected in the minds of the Jews. They're so integral to one another that they feel like that in the narrative, these two things have to go together. All right? So this is as much a part of the story as anything else is. You can't have the Feast of the Passover without the story that goes with it. It doesn't make sense any other way. And so this is very important. And I think it also fulfills the concept that Moses tells them in verses 25 through 27, where he says, you need to relay all of this to each generation from hereafter. All right? Every generation needs to know about this. So when you don't just tell them how to do the Passover, you tell them why you're doing the Passover. You tell them the whole story, and then you tell them the mechanics of how the Passover works. Because it's all part and parcel of the same thing. Just like today, if all we told our kids is on Sunday, the Christians gather and we partake of this bread and we partake of this fruit of the vine, and then we go home and we didn't tell them any of the story that went along with it, eventually that would lose all meaning whatsoever. So the story is interconnected so crucially with the events that are happening that you've got to have them juxtaposed to one another. All right. So Passover. So let's talk about some bits about Passover. So the word for Passover is actually Pesach, and you'll see that if you. That's the Hebrew word for it. It actually means Passover, or to skip actually is what it means, but that's the idea, Passover. The instructions for the feast that conclusively you can find throughout the Pentateuch are located in those passages there, Exodus 12 and 13, Leviticus 23, Numbers 9, Numbers 28. Numbers 9 is actually the second observance of the Passover, and then Deuteronomy 16, of course, when Moses is re-giving the law to the second generation, or the generation of Israelites that are going to inherit the land, he's giving them additional details there as well. Some bits about timing and the Jewish calendar, because this actually is kind of important and gives some additional details for you. So one of the things that we see here, and we see it right off the bat in Exodus chapter 12, is that the Passover is going to begin, these set of events are going to begin the Jewish religious calendar. Their religious calendar, and I'll talk about that in just a second, starts in the spring, all right? So God says, this is the first and the foremost. You put this on the 14th day of the first month, and then the Feast of the Unleavened Bread runs right along there with it. The Passover, in case you're curious, for this year is from March 27th to 4/4. So for the upcoming year, if we were Hebrew, or if we were Jewish, we would be celebrating the Passover in late March, and that's about the time frame that normally their year would start. So that gives you some kind of idea of when the Jewish calendar starts, is in that late March, April time frame. And then they would actually take the lamb that they were going to use for the Passover on the 10th day of Nisan or Abib, and they would keep it until the 14th day when the Passover would actually occur. I want to say just briefly as we look at this table here, so this is the Jewish calendar. A couple months, most of these months lost their original Jewish name. These are actually the names that were given coming out of Babylonian exile. So you can see all those months there. You see where it starts. Of course, Nisan, we're all pretty familiar with. And then it goes on down through the 12th month. The Jewish calendar is lunar based. So in other words, each month starts on a new moon. And the new moon, for those of you who aren't big on your lunar cycles, is when the moon is dark. All right, so when the moon is totally dark, that's a new moon. Halfway through the moon cycle is when it's a full moon, all right? So the sighting of the new moon, for those of you who are big feast wonks or like looking at the Jewish feasts, so the sighting of the new moon is what kicked off the months, and they would have people who would actually go out and certify, I saw the new moon, and then that would kick off the new lunar month. The Passover, therefore, starting on the 14th day of that cycle, means that the Passover was always supposed to occur on the full moon. So think about it for a second here. The night that God came through and slaughtered all the Egyptians was during a night of a full moon. Now, presumably that the air is clear and that there's no rain. It is Egypt. But more than likely, those people died in the light of a full moon. And that's how all Passovers were intended to occur. And that would actually help precipitate the Israelites celebrating the Passover feast. But again, if you think about it, I'm sure word got out in the 10th plague that there had been proclaimed that the firstborn of all Egypt are going to die. And if you're a parent, I know like Megan and I, we go check on the kids every night before we put them to bed. I'm sure some of you have small kids. Like we put the kids to bed and then a few hours later we go back and we make sure that the kids haven't like materialized into another universe, that they are still actually in the bed and haven't rolled off or gone somewhere else. So you can imagine as a parent of a small child, you've got a firstborn. How many times did you get up that night to make sure that your firstborn was still breathing in the bed? You can just imagine, even the Israelites, even the faithful Israelites who had done everything, I bet those parents were still getting up and checking on those kids during the middle of the night. And they were able to do so more than likely because all of this is going on during a full moon, in the light of the full moon. So something really interesting to think about, and it's also very interesting as you get into some New Testament passages that talk about things Jesus said during the night of the full moon. The civil calendar actually started, so everybody else in that part of the world, their calendar started with actually the harvest, which happened in the 7th month. That's why it's bolded there, the month of Tishri. So that was, not the harvest, the time of sowing your grain, the start of the agricultural year was Tishri right there, and that was the 7th month. And that would track the years that had come and gone for them on a civil calendar. It also coincides with the Feast of Trumpets, or otherwise today known as Rosh Hashanah. And it was, again, the time of sowing. When you read about in the Bible, when you read about the early and the latter rains, the early rains, this is counter what you think. The early rains always happen in the last part of the year. The latter rains always start in the first part of the year from our perspective. So you need the early rains to make the things grow when they're germinating. You need the latter rains to make sure that the harvest is there. And that's one of the promises that God had made. He will send the early and the latter rains so that their harvest would be abundant. But we shouldn't lose track of probably the most important thing here is the fact that God places this event as the beginning of their calendar. The founding of the nation of Israel is based on the miracle that was done in Egypt, the 10th plague, and the Passover. It would be the same for us to say, if we're no longer going to celebrate January 1st as the start of our New Year's, instead, we're going to celebrate September 3rd, 1783, not July 4th, 1776. It's actually equivalent to September 3rd, 1783. And I say September 3rd, 1783, because that is the date that England actually signed the Treaty of Paris and said, okay, you're a new nation. So you can imagine, God here is saying, the founding of you as a people is wrapped up in the works that I have done to lift the bondage of Egypt away from you. And that's who they are. Who's eligible to partake? Well, as I mentioned before, this can be found in the latter part of Exodus chapter 12. First off, all the congregation of Israel was supposed to partake. And I mean all the congregation of Israel. If you were connected to Israel in any way, shape, or form, if you just got there, if you were just converted, you are supposed to partake in the body of Israel here. Even those who were from the mixed multitude that we're going to see that come up out of Egypt were those that were supposed to partake in this feast. No foreigners were supposed to take it. Now, the word foreigners is actually that Hebrew word nakar, which actually means outsiders. All right, so no outsiders to the community of Israel could partake in the feast. But everybody inside the community of Israel was to partake of the feast. So in essence, what it means is all circumcised of Israel of any status, And it goes on, and it mentions there in the latter part of chapter 12, it talks about, in chapter 12, verse 44, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner, a hired servant, those who basically are not circumcised shall not eat it. But those who are of any status, if they're a slave to not a slave, if they're in the community of Israel, they are to partake of the feast. All right? They had to be circumcised. That's right, yeah. So just as I'm saying there, they have to be, in essence, all the circumcised of Israel, which is how they identified who was in the community. And I think that would have been abundantly clear to the Israelites, who was in and who was out. The circumcised of Israel are those who are not outsiders. Yeah. Right.
And then once that's done, this is in a sense Moses and God reestablishing. We're not just leaving, we're creating something new.
Right.
That's how the Passover relates to us outside of the nation, because that's kind of what the Exodus is. God created his people, and now people outside of that are going to come to him.
Yeah, so the point that was made was very much that, so this is still a part of defining who the people of God are. And it's a great point, because the nation of Israel is a different kind of thing than the nation of Egyptians. Egyptians were ethnically a people. Cushites were ethnically a people. The group of the Israelites, as we see them coming up, are not ethnically a people. They are referred to as a mixed multitude. So the point is very valid in that this people has to be defined by something. And it wasn't defined on a color of skin. It wasn't defined on a status. It wasn't defined on who your forefathers were, per se, particularly. You could be attached to the nation of Israel. And I think this portion of it, defining who is part of Israel, is pretty important here, certainly from the outset. Now, obviously, that changes as you go forward. But here in this initial part, we see that that is a very important part of it. That's an excellent point. As I said before, native born doesn't seem to matter, and it doesn't discriminate against those who are seeking to be a part of Israel. So here are some details on the sacrifice that I wanted to pass along to you guys. So first off, the instruction is you're going to take a lamb on the 10th day. It would be a male lamb on the 10th day for each house or group of houses depending on your size. So if it's just a couple of you and you can't eat a lamb, you get together with some neighbors that are close to you, and then all of you kind of have to do some rough mathematics there, but you basically say, okay, this group of people here can eat this lamb. And the idea wasn't to gorge yourself, but that everybody would have a portion of the lamb and that you would eat as much of the lamb as possible, or that you would eat all of the lamb as possible. So you're taking a lamb for your community, your group that you live with there. The lamb that you were to take was to be perfect and was to be a year old. It was to have no imperfections, so it was to be a complete whole lamb. Imperfections in a lamb, not a lamb guy. I've eaten lamb. Lamb is great. Never raised any lambs. But from what I hear, obviously we know you can get spotted lambs. You can get lambs that are blind in one eye. You can have lambs that have a split ear, evidently. And none of that affects the meat. All those lambs would probably just taste just delicious. Lamb is really good. But that is not the lamb that God wanted them to select. God wanted them to select a lamb that was a perfect lamb. Now, usually those lambs, the male lambs, a lot of times were all slaughtered off except for a few prize lambs that were the main breeding lambs, and then all your other lambs would be females, so that way you'd have a lot more flock, and then you'd just be perpetuating the genes of this really good lamb. But God says, no, you give me the really good lamb first. And so that's what the expectation is there with that. They were to keep it for 4 days. So you kind of had to sequester this lamb and make sure that it didn't get harassed or anything happened to it from the other lambs or anything else that might be out there trying to get it. And so you had to hold on to it for 4 days until the sacrifice was to occur. And then you would kill it at twilight but in the process, you are to break none of its bones. Now, from the outset, let me say this. There's nothing you would think, there's no reason ostensibly why you would give the command, break none of its bones. There's nothing there in and of itself about not breaking any of its bones. But obviously we know, and as is going to be discussed in the next class, there's obviously a reason why God is giving this command. There's also in the language where it mentions this, and especially there in the beginning of chapter 12, when it talks about killing it, there's an interesting grammatical construction there in verse 6, which is where it's mentioned, where the instructions are that all Israel is going to take their own lamb, but then when it flips down to talking about killing, it talks about it in the singular, as if there's only one lamb for all the community of Israel. So there are multiple lambs in the verses before that, but when you get to verse 6 and you talk about killing it, it's almost as if the writer now flips and is saying there's going to be one lamb. Now again, keep all of this in your back pocket for Sunday, because that's where we're going to address a lot of these issues. But obviously, there's a significant amount of foreshadowing there. And actually, when we get to the Second Temple period, all Israel is you're still doing lambs everywhere. But at the temple, in the Second Temple period, there is the main lamb that the high priest is killing at the appropriate time. And it is kind of the lamb for the community. Now, spoiler alert a little bit here, not really. But at the same time, that the high priest is slaughtering the main lamb at the temple, Christ is also declaring it's finished on the cross. And there's an obvious connection in what's going on there. Again, spoiler alert for next Sunday, but that obviously there's some intention about what's going on here. It was to happen at twilight, as is mentioned in the instructions, and twilight simply means the periods between the nights. Likely this has happened into late afternoon to allow time to prepare the feast, so you had to have enough daylight to do it. Deuteronomy chapter 16:6 actually tells them that the sacrifice needs to happen about the same time that this happened the first time around, when the sun was going down. So you're talking about late afternoon. So that was the instruction that was given in Deuteronomy chapter 16:6. So there, in addition to this, in later instructions about the Passover, and I'm going to throw this in here because I think it's very interesting, and it's always fascinating to me if you can kind of throw some real-world numbers behind what was required of the Jews when they made or the Israelites when they made these sacrifices. So on the Passover day, once they had been fully established as a nation, they were to also offer these burnt offerings. So in addition to the Passover lamb, they had these burnt offerings: 2 young bulls, a ram, 7 additional lambs, each one to be a year old, also all of those animals to be perfect. And they were also to offer these grain offerings. So you get fine flour and you would mix it with oil. And I converted the ephos, the measurement that you see there. You read these measurements in the Bible and you're like, I don't have a clue what that is. But I was like, so I convert it to liters, because in college I had this great affinity with 2 liters. I would drink a 2 liter whole. So I really know, I have a really good grasp of what a liter is, because I used to just kill 2 liters in college. I don't do that anymore. But that's how I think about these things. And so for the 2 bulls there, total, you would have 6.6 liters of this fine flour with oil, 4.4 for the ram itself, 15.4 liters of this, so 26 liters of this combination of fine flour and oil. So think about when you go to the grocery, 13 2-liters worth of fine flour mixed with oil was given in addition to the burnt offering on this special day of feasting, which is a lot of fine flour and oil to offer up with in addition to these animals. And as you look at that actually is a very expensive offering that God is calling upon the Israelites to make. That is a lot of wealth right there that is being burnt as a burnt offering. In addition to it, you would offer a goat as a sin offering, and as we see later, all the burnt offerings, those kind of things, after your sin had been cleared. So this is what's called upon the Israelites to sacrifice in Numbers chapter 28. And they were to do so every single day of the Passover and the unleavened bread feast throughout the duration, all right? So it's pretty substantial. The meal itself is roasted completely in the fire and carefully calculated so that each person would have enough with none left over. And whatever you do have left over, if you've miscalculated, you have to burn what's left over. And you're to serve it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. So the roasting process here takes minimal setup. You don't need any pots or pans. You don't need anything to boil. You can just do this right quick on a split. The bitter herbs were easy to find in that area of the world. And the unleavened bread, amongst other ideas here, are really easy to make and emphasize the speed. But what's the point? In the Israelites' mind, when this was originally given, what's the point? What is he trying to emphasize here? Just think about the emblems themselves. What's the emphasis here? I'm sorry? Christ. Let's take that off the table. Sorry, just looking at these things, what's being emphasized here for the Israelites? Why not leavened bread? Why not boiled lamb's got to be better than this? Why not, find some time, cut up some herb? What's being emphasized here? Everything's fast. Everything has to be done like this. Because the expectation is that when this is done, how do you tell them to eat it? With their shoes on, with their staff in hand. Nobody does that. They had these low tables, they were reclining. You don't sit there with your shoes on, in your staff in hand, but this is maybe that might be right, actually. Yeah, but the idea is that all of this was to be done such that they could just get up and walk out. And what God was requiring of them is the faith that when this meal is over, you get out and walk out. They had to have, there's not going to be breakfast the next morning. All right? There's no break. This is all to be gone. You're burning all of it. You're not saving any of it because you're out of here as soon as all this is over. And they are supposed, and he expects them to have faith about what's getting ready to be done. A couple more concepts here. So the blood of the lamb is to be collected and painted with hyssop on the doors, and don't go outside. All right. Imagine if you're an Israelite. We talked last time about the 9th plague and about those people who were living in the darkness and they could see over there that they had light. Okay, now imagine that was 3 days ago. Now you fast forward 3 days, you come out, you're an Egyptian and you're living on the edge of where the Israelites live. And you look out over there and there's a sea of red doors that are covered in blood. Can you imagine how eerie that must have been? I cannot, and the message to both groups, if you're an Israelite, you go in that house and you don't come out. If you're an Egyptian, something's going on over there. In light of everything that we've suffered those past few weeks, I see a sea of red doors covered in blood over there. Something big is about to happen. I just can't imagine what you would think and what you would feel. And it mentions in the passage that God will go and he will see the blood on their doors. Now, did God need to see the blood on their doors? Obviously not, right? So verse 13 and 23 in chapter 12 reference when God sees the blood, he won't judge whoever's inside of it. He won't kill who's in there. He didn't need to see it, but who needed to see it? Who needed to see this visual? Egypt needed to see this visual. Egypt needed to see this visual to understand the judgment that is about to come on them. And who's the other party that needed to see this visual? Israel needed to see this visual. They needed to understand. They needed to identify who is the community of God. These people were staying in a house that was covered in blood and not to come out till the judgment was complete. The blood of the sacrifice literally rests on the door of my house, and anyone who comes through that door is covered by the blood of the sacrifice. All right, that's one of the few things I want to leave you with. If you were entering the community of Israel, you had to enter by the blood-stained door, literally. That's literally how you had to get into the community of Israel. So it's just a powerful picture. Is that the end? No, that's the 5 minutes. Oh, see, I'm like hurrying through it. I don't even have to. All right. So I stress that because it's just one of the things that in Scripture, I feel like if we could see it, obviously there's passages like the crossing of the Red Sea and some of these other things that we're like, yeah, we'd really like to be able to see that. But I think if we had been able to see that scene waiting for God to come in judgment and understand I think everybody understood something momentous was about to occur. And obviously, God is pointing to so many things here. So many patterns are starting right here that when I see the blood, I will skip over this house. I see the life that's in the blood, it's here, I skip over it. The people who are residing and staying in it are covered by that blood. The word atonement literally means to cover. And here it is, literally covering the house. These are some of the things. Israel can't understand the fullness of what God is trying to communicate here. But he's kicking off some patterns that are going to mean more and more and more as you go through the Bible and as we move through redemptive history. And so when you think back to what they saw and obviously what's being displayed here for these people. So also right on the back of this, you have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. All right, so the 7-day feast coincides, so it also kicks off the unleavened bread. And it begins right there on the Passover. On the first day and the last day, there are special worship services that are given to God to celebrate the works that he's done for them. And that so there was a tremendous, one of the efforts that they're required to take is to remove any leaven from their house. Now, I don't know a lot about cooking. I've already said, I don't know a lot about a lot of things tonight. I keep feeling like saying I don't know a lot about that. But so, one of the things that they're required to do in this chapter was to remove any leaven from their house. And actually, in reading some folks, that actually was a little bit more difficult than you might otherwise realize. Actually, the yeast spores traveled fairly easily. All you had to do pretty much was leave the bread outside, leave unleavened bread outside in the sun with some fermenting agent, and actually would just ferment on its own. So it was actually a little bit of a task to get all the leaven out of your house. And it says that persons with leaven in their homes will be cut off. So being cut off likely refers to a person who's cut off from the formal benefits of the covenant, all right? So it might mean in some cases, there's a lot of passages in the Old Testament that talk about if you do this, you'll be cut off if you do that. It could mean banishment. It could mean capital punishment. And there's a wide array of passages there. But largely, it means that you are cut off from all the benefits of being in the covenant nation of Israel. And Israel disobeyed the Passover so badly and so many other covenant commandments that we don't really know exactly what this would look like in totality. In fact, there's a few times where it's mentioned that the Passover is celebrated the right way. So it stands out when it's like, well, there it was, celebrated the right way. So you'll recall Hezekiah brings it back, and they had to celebrate it in the second month because none of the priests were clean at the time that they were supposed to do it. You'll remember in Josiah is one of those kings that is majorly underrated, but if you can underrate one of the kings there. But it mentions specifically in the reign of Josiah that a Passover like the one that Josiah threw hadn't been done that way ever since then. So think about how many kings, how many Passovers have come and gone that they haven't done it the right way. And we only really read about a couple times here in the Old Testament prior to that Second Temple period, the first time, the second time, and a couple of other times in the land, and that's it. So many things weren't executed the way that they were supposed to, and that really ends up being the problem. Because one of the most important instructions was that this was be a memorial forever to all your generations. It was to be explained to every generation in its importance, and failure to commemorate these feasts was a contributing factor to the downfall of Israel. The failure to do what God told them to do and to explain to the next generation, this is why we're doing this, was a major reason for the downfall of Israel, just as it would be today if we stopped explaining to our next generation why we do what we do. And so with that, next time we're going to pick up talking about what this all means to us. Christ is our Passover lamb.